I swear to this day, none of us ever figured out how he managed to be everywhere we went. But I know for certain that man wasn't supposed to be there. It was in 7th grade, on a spring field trip to the State Museum. Our class had been buzzing about it all week because it meant missing a full day of regular lessons. We packed onto the bus that morning, laughing, trading snacks, and fighting over the good seats near the back. I remember sitting by the window, staring out at the blur of houses and trees as the bus rumbled down the highway. That's when I first noticed it. A black sedan, old but polished, hugging the lane behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of cars follow school buses for a while. But every time our drivers switched lanes or made a turn, the sedan did the exact same. I watched for over 20 minutes, my unease growing each time I glanced back. I nudged my friend sitting beside me. That car's been behind us since we left. He shrugged it off, saying maybe the driver was headed the same direction. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man behind the wheel was staring straight ahead at us. When we finally pulled into the museum parking lot, the sedan parked too. Not in the visitor area, but off to the side, half hidden beneath a tree. I remember craning my neck to see, but the windows were tinted, and I couldn't make out his face. Inside the museum, everything felt normal for a while. Our teacher handed out worksheets for us to fill in as we walked through the exhibits. I almost convinced myself I had been paranoid. But then, near the ancient history section, I felt eyes on me. He was there, a tall man in a dark jacket, standing a few yards away from our group. He wasn't pretending to look at the displays like other adults. He wasn't even holding a brochure or camera. He was just staring. Not at the artifacts, not at the walls. At us, at me. I froze, gripping the paper in my hand. My teacher didn't notice, too busy corralling the rowdy kids. I whispered to my friend again, asking if he saw the man. He looked, and immediately, his joking demeanor disappeared. "That's the guy from the car," he muttered. We both tried to tell ourselves it was a coincidence, that maybe he had kids here too. But the longer we stayed, the clearer it became. He never left our side. Every room we moved into, he appeared seconds later. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just followed, always far enough that no adult seemed to notice, but close enough that we knew. I remember the sound of my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. In the dimly lit fossil exhibit, I felt something brush against my backpack strap. I whipped around. He was right there, only a few feet away. Too close. I stumbled back and almost knocked into my teacher. I tried to tell her, but the words stuck in my throat. I was afraid she wouldn't believe me. And when I glanced back, he had already stepped into the crowd of tourists, blending in again. By lunchtime, my nerves were shot. The museum cafeteria was noisy and crowded, but even among the chaos, I found him, sitting alone at a table in the corner, untouched food in front of him, watching our class eat. I couldn't eat a single bite. Every time I looked up, he hadn't moved. Not once. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a small wave of relief. Our group walked back to the bus, kids chattering about their favorite exhibits. But my stomach dropped as soon as we pulled out of the lot. The black sedan was behind us again. This time, I wasn't the only one who noticed. A girl near the back shouted, "That car's following us." The bus erupted with nervous laughter, but soon kids crowded the windows, whispering. The driver must have seen it too, because he sped up, taking a different route back to school. And yet, every turn we made, the car made too. Finally, when we pulled into the school parking lot, the sedan slowed and kept going. It drove past the entrance, disappearing down the road. A few kids cheered, others clapped sarcastically, like it was some kind of joke. But I couldn't shake the dread, because as we were unloading, I glanced across the street. He was there, standing on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching us. Not smiling, not moving, just waiting. I blinked, and a car passed in front of him. By the time it cleared, he was gone. No one saw him again after that. The teachers brushed it off as a strange coincidence. But I know what I saw. That man wasn't just following our bus. He was following us. And I've never forgotten his face pressed against the glass of that sedan. Eyes locked on me like he was choosing. To this day, whenever I catch a black car in my rearview mirror for longer than a few minutes, I feel that same cold weight in my chest. Because what haunts me most is not knowing what he wanted. Or worse, knowing he might still be out there, waiting for another bus. She was right there 1 second standing in front of the glass, with her hand pressed to it, and then she was gone. What they found inside the empty tank still keeps me awake at night. Our 8th grade field trip to the city aquarium was supposed to be the highlight of the semester. Everyone had been buzzing about it for weeks. The teachers had handed out matching wristbands, and the bus ride was filled with chatter and bad singing. I wasn't particularly excited. I'd been to the aquarium before with my family, but for a lot of kids in my class, this was their first time. The place itself was dim and chilly, the kind of cold that creeps into your sleeves and makes the back of your neck feel damp. The lighting was low, with glowing blue tanks stretching down long halls, each one filled with drifting alien creatures. I remember thinking how easy it would be to get lost in there if you stepped away from your group for even a minute. My friend Emily didn't really hang out with anyone. She was quiet, the kind of kid who liked reading more than talking, and she had this thing about the ocean. She carried a notebook everywhere, sketching jellyfish, sharks, even squids, with a level of detail that creeped some people out. When we were released to wander in small groups, I ended up sticking near her, mostly because she seemed calmer than everyone else. About halfway through the trip, we reached one of the last hallways. Most of the tanks were lively sharks gliding past, stingrays sweeping along the sand, but one of them was completely empty. It was bigger than the rest, stretching almost wall to wall, with nothing inside but dark water. No fish, no coral, no decorations. Just a hollow tank with a single spotlight above it, barely illuminating the depths. Emily walked right up to the glass. She pressed her hand against it and leaned in, staring into the black water like she expected something to stare back. I nudged her shoulder, whispering, "There's nothing in there. Come on." But she didn't move. Her face was pale in the glow, and I noticed her breath fogging the glass. The water seemed colder than the others. After a long pause, she whispered, "It's not empty." The words sent a chill down my spine. I looked harder, but all I saw was the faint reflection of the spotlight rippling in the dark. A few other kids laughed at her and moved on to the next display, but I lingered, uneasy. I could have sworn, just for a second, I saw movement in there. Something pale, deeper than the light reached. And one of the teachers called us to regroup. I turned to wave Emily over. She was still pressed against the glass, both hands against it now. I sighed and started walking toward her, but in the time it took me to glance back at the teacher and then forward again, she was gone. I froze. The space in front of the glass was empty, except for her backpack, which hadn't been there before. It was propped upright, pressed against the inside of the tank. From where I stood, I could see the straps floating gently in the water, swaying as if something had just disturbed it. My stomach dropped. I stumbled back, yelling for the teacher. When she hurried over, I pointed at the tank, but the backpack was gone. The glass looked normal, nothing inside but dark water. The teacher scolded me for wandering off and insisted Emily must have joined another group. But the look on her face told me she'd seen the panic in mine. The rest of the trip blurred. Teachers walked us quickly through the remaining exhibits, clearly rattled, while pretending nothing was wrong. Back on the bus, everyone joked and chatted like usual. but the seat beside me was empty. Emily never came back. That night, my mom told me the school had contacted every parent. Emily's family thought she might have run off somewhere in the aquarium, maybe gotten lost in a staff-only section. The police searched the building, the surrounding streets, even security footage. The cameras showed her walking into that hallway with the rest of us. But there was nothing after that. No footage of her leaving. No sign of her anywhere. The aquarium denied having an empty tank. According to their records, that display had been drained for months, awaiting renovations. Yet I know what I saw. I saw her pressed against the glass, her hands leaving faint, foggy prints. And I know I saw her backpack inside, swaying in the water like it didn't belong to our world anymore. Weeks passed, and eventually people stopped talking about her. The school moved on. But I couldn't. Sometimes at night, I dream I'm standing in that hallway again. I hear a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass, echoing through the dark. And in the dream, I look up, and there she is, Emily, floating just beyond the reach of the light, her hair drifting like seaweed, her eyes open and watching me. I don't know what was in that tank, or what she saw when she pressed her hand to the glass. All I know is that when I walk past any aquarium now, I never look too long into the dark water, because I'm afraid something might look back. He wasn't on the attendance list. He wasn't even a real teacher. But somehow, he walked among us that day, smiling, guiding, and leading us deeper into places we were never supposed to see. It was the spring of my freshman year, and our biology class took a field trip to the city zoo. I wasn't particularly excited. Zoos had always depressed me a little, but I figured it was at least better than sitting through another hour of lectures. We arrived mid-morning, the sun already hot against the asphalt of the parking lot. I remember the chatter of kids buzzing with freedom, our teacher, Mrs. Callahan, trying to wrangle everyone into neat lines. That's when I first noticed him. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, with thinning hair and glasses. He wore a lanyard with what looked like an ID card, though I didn't get a good look at it then. Mrs. Callahan introduced him to us quickly. This is Mr. Harris. He's a substitute chaperone helping us out today. She didn't sound entirely sure when she said it, but we were too distracted to care. At first, he seemed normal enough, quiet, polite, blending in with the group. He laughed at the penguins, asked a few kids what their favorite animals were. But as the day went on, his role started to shift. He wasn't just following along anymore, he was leading. "Come on," he said at one point, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There's a path back here most people don't know about. You'll get a closer look." We followed him, maybe 15 of us, while the rest of the group stayed behind with Mrs. Callahan. The path was cracked, lined with weeds, a kind of walkway that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air grew cooler the deeper we went, and the sounds of laughing kids and animals faded behind us. "What's down here?" one girl asked nervously. "You'll see," he said. "Something special." The path curved and opened up to a shaded area behind the reptile house. The glass on the back windows was smeared, almost opaque, but he pointed out strange shapes moving inside. "See that? These are the specimens they don't show to the public. Dangerous ones." A couple of kids pressed their faces to the glass, but I held back. The inside was too dark, the shapes too slow, too deliberate, like something waiting. After a few minutes, he herded us onward. That was when I noticed. None of this was on the zoo map we'd been given. We passed rusted gates, stacks of broken crates, and cages with heavy padlocks. At one point, I saw a bird cage large enough to hold a person. Its bars were bent. The group grew quieter. Some of the kids whispered about turning back. But every time someone suggested it, Mr. Harris's tone grew sharp. "Just a little farther. Don't spoil it for the others." I remember the smell next to air, heavy with something metallic, like old blood mixed with damp earth. It clung to the back of my throat. Finally, He led us to a small outbuilding. The paint was peeling, the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and gestured inside. "Go on," he said. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a single dangling bulb. Inside were shelves lined with jars, cloudy liquids sloshing inside them. Something floated in each one shapes I couldn't quite make out. Small, curled things that might have been animals, or might not have. A girl gasped and backed out immediately. That's when I noticed Mr. Harris wasn't looking at the jars. He was watching us, his lips twitching like he was holding back a grin. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us. The bulb flickered once, then went out. In the pitch dark, I heard him whisper, "This is where the real zoo begins." Panic spread instantly. Kids screamed, shoving against the door, clawing at the walls. I pressed myself to the corner, listening to the shuffle of shoes and the rising hysteria. Somewhere in the dark, I swear I heard him laugh low, steady, unbothered. Then, just as suddenly, the door burst open. Mrs. Callahan stood there, frantic, with another zookeeper at her side. She pulled us out one by one, scolding, trembling with anger. When I turned back, the room was empty. No jars, no shelves, no man. Just a bare shed with a concrete floor. We tried to explain, but the staff swore the building had been abandoned for years. And when Mrs. Callahan demanded to know who Mr. Harris was, the zoo officials grew pale. No one by that name worked there. No substitute chaperone had been scheduled for our trip. They checked the bus, the parking lot, even the security cameras. There was no trace of him. For the rest of the day, we were kept close, under tight supervision. But I couldn't stop thinking about that man, about how casually he had slipped into our group, how easily we'd followed him into a place we were never supposed to be. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice. That calm, coaxing tone, promising something special just out of sight. I never went back to that zoo, and I don't think I ever will. I can still remember the smell of damp wood and mildew when we opened that door, and the sound of something moving inside, long after we knew the cabin was supposed to be empty. It happened during my sophomore year of high school, on a class hiking trip meant to teach us about local ecology. The plan was simple. A few miles of trail, lunch at the summit, and back before sunset. We were in groups of 10, each with a teacher or chaperone. I was in the group led by Mr. Kramer, our history teacher more book, smart than outdoorsy, but friendly enough. The day started fine. The weather was cool. The trail was muddy, but manageable. We laughed, took pictures, pointed out deer tracks. But somewhere after lunch, we took a wrong turn. I don't know if Mr. Kramer misread the map, if we just weren't paying attention, but after another hour of hiking, we realized we hadn't passed any of the marked checkpoints the school gave us. That was when things started to feel off. The trail narrowed into a darker part of the woods. The trees were taller, the canopy thicker, and even though it wasn't that late, it felt like dusk under those branches. The air was colder too, heavy with the smell of wet earth. We walked in silence for a while, everyone tired and uneasy. Then, up ahead, one of the girls in our group pointed through the trees. "There's a building," she said. Sure enough, a structure sat maybe 50 yards off the trail, partially hidden by brush. It looked like an old cabinwood gray and rotting, roof sagging in the middle. Everyone reacted the same way, confused. We weren't anywhere near a campground, and there wasn't supposed to be anything man-made out here. Mr. Kramer hesitated, but eventually said, "Let's just check it out. Maybe we can get our bearings." Up close, the cabin was worse. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and all the windows were boarded up from the inside. It looked abandoned for decades. Yet when Mr. Kramer pushed the door, it creaked open easily, almost like someone had oiled it recently. The smell hit us immediately: mildew, rot, and something faintly sour. a kind of smell that makes the back of your throat tighten. The inside was dark, but beams of light slipped through cracks in the boards. We stepped inside cautiously. The floor groaned under our weight. At first glance, the place looked empty, just dust, broken furniture, and old wood. But then one of the kids gasped, "Look!" Along the far wall were shoes, dozens of them. Tiny shoes, all children's sizes. Sneakers, boots, sandals, some so worn they barely held together. They were arranged in uneven rows, side by side, like they'd been carefully placed there. A nervous laughter rippled through the group, like we were all trying to brush it off as weird, but not terrifying. But then someone else pointed at the walls. There were Polaroids taped up in clusters, hundreds of them. Each photo was of children smiling, crying, sitting in chairs, standing in fields. Some looked recent, others old and faded. None of us recognized the kids. I remember my stomach sinking as I stepped closer to look. The pictures weren't organized randomly. Each cluster seemed to feature the same child in different poses or places. And in some, you could see the edges of the same cabin wall behind them. That's when we all heard it. From deeper inside the cabin, beyond a closed door at the back, came a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Everyone froze. Mr. Kramer tried to act calm. He whispered, "Okay, let's go. Now." We turned toward the door, but before we could reach it, the dragging sound stopped. Silence pressed down on us, thick and absolute. Then came a creak, like another door opening somewhere in the back. One of the girls started crying quietly. Someone else muttered, "It's probably animals," though their voice shook. We didn't wait to find out. We bolted out of that cabin, stumbling over roots and branches as we scrambled back toward the trail. I remember looking over my shoulder once. Through a crack in the boarded window, I could have sworn I saw movement, a pale face watching us leave. We didn't stop running until we reached a clearing. By some miracle, another Chaperone's group appeared on the ridge above us. They were as surprised to see us as we were relieved to see them. Together, we found the correct trail and made it back just as the sun was setting. No one talked much on the bus ride home. Mr. Kramer told us not to mention the cabin to the other groups, that we had just gotten lost. But the silence among us kids said everything. We all knew what we saw. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that place, the rows of shoes, the Polaroids, the dragging sound behind the door. A few of us even tried looking up records about missing children in the area, but we never found anything that matched. Sometimes I think maybe we imagined parts of it, but our fear made it worse than it was. But then I remember the smell and the way those photos were taped so carefully, like someone was proud of them. And the worst part? None of us ever heard the sound of that back door closing again, which means whatever was inside might still be out there. I heard it before I could see its slow, heavy breathing, coming from somewhere in the pitch-black room. At first, I thought it was one of my classmates, until I realized everyone else was holding their breath. It happened during a 7th grade field trip to the Natural History Museum. I remember the day so vividly, partly because I loved those kinds of places, and partly because of what happened when we got trapped inside one of the exhibits after closing. The museum itself was massive, with towering dinosaur skeletons and dark halls lined with glass cases. Our group had spent most of the day moving from one exhibit to another, and by the late afternoon, we were all exhausted. Our last stop was the Hall of Ancient Mammals, a dimly lit wing of the museum with huge taxidermy displays and life-size replicas of extinct creatures. It was colder in there than in the rest of the building. The air felt damp, like being inside a cave. I remember thinking it would have been the perfect place for a horror movie. Rows of glass eyes from stuffed animals seemed to follow us as we walked, and the sound of our sneakers echoed too loudly against the tile floor. Our teacher, Ms. Ramirez, asked us to gather near the far wall for a short lecture before we boarded the bus. A few kids wandered off to look at the exhibits, but I stayed close. I was already uneasy. The lighting was dim, and the further you walked toward the back, the less natural light there was just overhead bulbs casting strange, uneven shadows. After about 10 minutes, Ms. Ramirez checked her watch and called everyone together. We started heading back toward the main entrance, but when we reached the double doors that led into the hall, they didn't budge. She tried both handles, jiggled them, then pulled harder. They were locked. At first, we all thought it was just a mistake. Maybe a guard had closed them early. But after a few more minutes of rattling the handles and knocking, we realized no one was coming. Somehow, the doors had been locked from the outside, and we were trapped. The lights above us flickered once, and then half of them shut off completely, plunging the far end of the room into near darkness. A nervous laugh spread through the group, but even the kids who usually cracked jokes went quiet fast. Ms. Ramirez told us to stay calm, that she would call for help, but when she tried her phone, there was no signal inside the thick-walled building. We were stuck waiting. It wasn't long before we started to hear things. At first, it was just the faint creaking of the building old wood settling, or maybe air ducts groaning overhead. But then there was something else, something slower, deliberate. A dragging sound, like footsteps shuffling across tile. I turned to the kid standing beside me, Sam, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" He nodded, eyes wide. A couple of other kids had heard it too. We all stared toward the back of the hall, where the shadows were thickest. That's when we heard the breathing. It was steady, but heavy, like someone trying to control their breath while hiding. Every time the room went silent, it was there again, faint but undeniable, coming from somewhere just beyond the displays. Ms. Ramirez tried to keep everyone calm, telling us it was probably just the air vents, but I could tell she didn't believe it herself. The sound was too human, too close. We all huddled together near the doors, trying to stay in the circle of light. The breathing would stop for a while, then start again, sometimes closer than before. I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. At one point, one of the boys shouted, "Who's there?" His voice echoed through the hall, and for a few seconds, there was no response. Then, from the dark, something answered. A single, deliberate exhale. Several of the kids screamed, and Ms. Ramirez barked at us to stay calm, but even she was shaking. We didn't know what to do. The museum was supposed to be empty. Our group was the last scheduled tour, but the breathing was real, and it was moving. Suddenly, one of the display cases at the back made a sharp thud, like someone had slapped the glass. We all jumped. Ms. Ramirez shouted again for whoever was there to stop fooling around, but there was no reply, just silence. Then, slowly, the breathing started again, closer this time, as if it was coming from between the rows of exhibits. We pressed ourselves against the locked doors, as far from the darkness as we could get. Some kids were crying. I kept staring into the black space between the towering displays, half expecting to see something step out. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, we heard keys jingling on the other side of the door. The lock clicked, and one of the museum security guards pulled the doors open. He looked at us in confusion, asking why we hadn't left yet. Ms. Ramirez snapped at him, demanding to know why we'd been locked inside, but the guard just shook his head. He said no one had locked those doors. In fact, he claimed they'd been open the whole time. We rushed out into the main hall without looking back, desperate just to be out of that room. On the bus ride home, no one said much, but I kept thinking about one thing. If the doors had really been unlocked, like the guard said, then whoever was in that room with us could still be inside, even now, breathing, waiting. I was the only one who saw it blink, at least. I thought I was. But by the time I realized it wasn't just a mannequin, the museum doors had already been locked. Our 10th grade history class had taken a field trip to a Civil War museum about 2 hours from our school. It wasn't the kind of trip most people were excited about: dusty uniforms in glass cases, faded letters behind protective frames, and endless displays of muskets and bayonets. Still, the teachers insisted it was educational, so we all piled into buses and went. The building itself was eerie, even before anything happened. It was a tall, brick structure with narrow windows, built in the mid-1800s. Inside, the hallways felt more like a preserved hospital than a museum's stone floors. Creaking doors, dim lighting that made shadows stretch unnaturally long. My group was supposed to stay together, but I drifted toward the mannequin displays near the far corner. They had a full setup. Soldiers in gray and blue uniforms, positioned behind sandbags, posed mid-battle, with cracked drums and cannons around them. They were too realistic: pale wax skin, glassy eyes that caught the low light, fabric uniforms yellowed with age. I remember shivering, telling myself it was just how lifelike wax figures could be. That's when I saw it. One of the mannequins dressed in a Confederate uniform, rifle in hand, blinked. Not a twitch, not a flicker from my own tired eyes. A slow, deliberate blink, as if the figure had been holding its eyes open too long. I froze. I looked around, waiting for someone else in my class to notice, but they were too busy taking pictures or reading plaques. I told myself maybe it was a trick of the glass case, a shadow, something logical. But when I glanced back, the figure's head was tilted slightly more to the left, like it was watching me. My stomach dropped. I stepped backward, bumping into another student. When I looked again, the mannequin was still, rifle at its side, eyes blank and lifeless like the rest. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the kid who screamed about a blinking mannequin. The rest of the tour passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. But I couldn't stop glancing back at that display, certain something was wrong. Every time I looked, I swore the soldier's stance had shifted just slightly, an arm raised higher, the head turned a fraction more. By late afternoon, the teachers were herding us back toward the entrance. I was one of the last in line, waiting for everyone to filter through the gift shop. That's when I realized my backpack was missing. Panic set in inside. Was my wallet, my phone, everything. I told the teacher, and she reluctantly let me run back into the main exhibit hall to grab it. The museum was empty now. The echo of my sneakers against the stone floor made me feel like I shouldn't be there. The overhead lights had dimmed, and without the noise of dozens of kids, the silence was suffocating. I found my backpack leaning against a bench near the mannequin display. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. The soldier wasn't behind the glass anymore. The case stood open. The plexiglass panel slid to the side. The mannequin was gone. My throat went dry. I tried to tell myself maybe the curators had moved it for cleaning. Maybe someone had forgotten to lock the case. But then I heard it. The slow, deliberate creak of boots against the stone floor. I didn't want to look, but I did. At the far end of the hall, in the dim orange glow of an exit sign, stood the soldier. Same gray uniform, same pale skin, but now he wasn't frozen. He was standing on his own, head tilted toward me, eyes locked on mine. I couldn't move. My legs felt like concrete. The figure took a step forward. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow. Another step and another. I finally snapped out of it and ran. My backpack thudded against my shoulder as I sprinted through the empty hall, past the glass cases and faded banners, my breath ragged in my throat. I didn't stop until I reached the gift shop, where the teacher was waiting impatiently. She scolded me for taking so long, but I barely heard her. My classmates were already outside, boarding the bus. I glanced back once more at the museum doors. Through the narrow glass window, I saw him. The mannequin, no. The soldier was standing in the hallway, right where I had dropped my backpack. His face was pressed against the glass, eyes unblinking this time. watching me. We pulled away, the bus rumbling down the street. I tried to convince myself it was stress, imagination, a trick of the light. But when I checked my backpack later that night, tucked in the front pocket was something I didn't recognize. A rusted Civil War button, smeared with dirt, like it had been torn straight off a uniform. And I know I didn't put it there. I remember the sound before I remember the sight, something shifting in the dark, metal scraping lightly, like fingernails across a cage. I thought the zoo was supposed to be the safest place for kids, but what we found beneath, it still makes me wonder if I ever really left. It was in the 7th grade, during one of those spring field trips that everyone looked forward to. Our school took us to the zoo, the same one every class went to every year. At first, it was the usual. Groups of kids crowding around the lion enclosure, teachers stressing about head counts, and the faint smell of popcorn mixing with that sour animal stench that clung to the air. But around lunchtime, things shifted. My best friend Tyler had this thing where he always wanted to see what was off limits. He swore he knew where the zoo kept their food storage, and that there might even be secret animals, not on display. I wasn't exactly eager to get in trouble, but curiosity has a way of pulling you along when you're 12 years old. While the rest of the group was at the picnic tables, Tyler tugged at my sleeve and motioned for me and 2 other kids, Jordan and Emily, to follow him. He led us around the back of the reptile house, where the crowds thinned and the pathways were roped off with staff-only signs. The air was quieter there, the chatter and laughter of families fading until all I could hear was the low hum of machinery and the occasional distant roar. We slipped under the rope, ducked behind a stack of feed barrels, and found ourselves on a cracked concrete path lined with service doors. That was when Emily pointed to a grate in the ground half hidden by weeds and rusted nearly black. Unlike the other vents, this one was loose. Tyler grinned, crouching down to pry it open. The metal squealed, loud enough to make my stomach drop. We all froze, waiting to hear someone shout at us, but no one came. Below the grate, there was a dark opening, a stairwell leading down into concrete. "Come on," Tyler whispered, already lowering himself onto the steps. I hesitated, but the others followed, and within moments, I was climbing down after them. The air grew cooler, damp, and thick with the smell of old water and rust. My sneakers slapped softly on the steps until we reached the bottom, where a long tunnel stretched ahead, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with pipes, some dripping, others groaning faintly as water moved through them. Our footsteps echoed too loudly, and I felt the kind of nervous excitement you only get when you know you're somewhere you absolutely shouldn't be. As we walked, we noticed the doors, heavy, industrial ones, bolted shut. And then, beyond the first bend, we saw them. Cages. Not big enclosures like in the zoo above, but narrow metal cages stacked against the walls like kennels. Some had rust-eaten bars, others still had locks. What made my skin prickle was that inside a few of them were old, shredded blankets. And bones. Not human bones, at least. I hope not. It looked like small animal remains. Rabbits, birds. I couldn't tell, but they'd been there a long time. Jordan muttered that this had to be some kind of holding area for animals that weren't on display. That explanation almost worked until we reached the far end of the tunnel. One cage wasn't empty. At first, I thought it was, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw something shift in the shadows. It was low to the ground, hunched, its shape too large to be a stray dog, but too small for the bigger animals the zoo kept. The sound it made wasn't a growl or a hiss it was breathing. Slow, heavy, ragged breathing that filled the silence of the tunnel. Emily whispered, "What is that?" The thing stirred. I saw pale skin too pale, almost gray, and long fingers curl around the bars. The way it moved was wrong, jerky, like it hadn't stood up in a long time. And then it leaned forward, just enough for the light to catch its face. If you can even call it a face. Its eyes were huge and sunken, reflecting the dim light like an animal's. Its mouth opened just slightly, and I swear I heard it exhale a word that sounded like wait. We all bolted, no hesitation, no looking back. Our footsteps thundered against the concrete as we sprinted down the tunnel, our breaths ragged with panic. Behind us, I could hear the cage rattle violently, metal clanging against concrete. Something was trying to get out. We scrambled up the stairs, shoving the grate closed behind us. For a moment, none of us spoke, just stood there panting, trying to listen past the pounding of our hearts. But the tunnel was silent again. Back with the rest of the class, everything looked the same as before, kids laughing, teachers counting heads, families strolling with cotton candy in hand. I remember thinking how strange it felt, like the world above had no idea what was below. I never told any of the teachers. None of us did, partly because we knew we'd be in trouble, but mostly because we didn't know how to explain it. Sometimes I still dream about those eyes, staring through the bars. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can still hear that word in the dark. Wait. And I wonder if the cage ever opened after we left. I swear to this day, I wasn't supposed to hear my name inside that cell. It was whispered, soft and deliberate, from a place that should have been impossible. Our class field trip that year was to a decommissioned prison about an hour outside our town. It had been turned into a kind of historical landmark where tourists could walk through the cell blocks, listen to stories of old inmates, and even step into a solitary confinement cell to feel what it was like. I wasn't exactly thrilled. The building was massive, a looming gray block of stone with rusted bars on every window. It looked more like a mausoleum than anything else. The air inside was colder than outside, heavy with that old, damp smell of stone and rust. The guide, a gray-haired man with a voice that carried, led us down echoing corridors. Every footstep bounced off the walls. He talked about riots that had happened there, about men who had spent decades in these tiny cells. Most of my classmates were laughing, trying to spook each other, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, we came to the solitary confinement wing. It was darker here, quieter. The guide unlocked one of the heavy iron doors and invited us to step inside. Imagine being in here, alone, for 23 hours a day, he said. Some prisoners claimed they heard voices. Most went insane. A few of my classmates pushed each other in, laughing, daring one another to close the door. I stood near the back, uneasy. There was something different about this part of the prison. The air felt heavier, colder. That's when I heard it. Faint, but clear enough to freeze me in place. My name, whispered Eli. I turned immediately, expecting to see one of my friends smirking, but everyone was bunched up near the open cell, laughing and shoving each other. No one had spoken. I didn't say anything at first. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the acoustics in the hallway. The guide led us further down, past more closed solitary cells, their tiny slots for food trays like black mouths in the walls. That's when I heard it again. Eli. This time, I stopped walking. The voice was coming from a cell we hadn't entered. The door was locked tight, a thick steel slab with bolts that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. My stomach dropped. I leaned in just slightly, peering through the small slot. The cell was pitch black, nothing but shadows. But I swear, I could see movement inside. Just the faintest shift, like someone pressing against the far wall. I stumbled back, heart racing. My friend Mark noticed my face. "Dude, what's wrong?" he whispered. I shook my head quickly. "Nothing," I muttered. But my hands were clammy, and every hair on my arms stood on end. The guide kept talking, oblivious, moving the group further down the hall. I lingered for a second longer, staring at that locked door. Then it came one last time, clearer than before, right against the slot. Eli. I felt the warm rush of breath hit my ear. I bolted forward, nearly colliding with the group. My teacher scolded me for messing around, but I couldn't even form words. The rest of the tour blurred by. I barely heard the guide as he showed us the cafeteria, the yard, the guard towers. All I could think about was that voice. How did it know my name? When the trip ended and we boarded the bus, I sat by the window, staring at the prison as it grew smaller in the distance. I kept telling myself maybe one of my friends had slipped away to scare me, but no one admitted to it, and honestly, none of them could have pulled it off without me seeing. That night, I lay in bed replaying it in my head. The whisper, the movement in the cell, the rush of breath against my ear. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, but then I realized it was real. A whisper, coming from the corner of my room. Eli. My blood went cold. My room was dark, but I could just barely make out the outline of my desk, my chair, and a shape crouched low on the floor. I didn't move. I couldn't. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was my imagination, and when I opened them again, it would be gone. When I finally forced myself to look, the corner was empty, but the air was freezing. And on my knitstand, sitting neatly folded, was the brochure from the prison tour. I hadn't brought it home. I never told anyone the full story. Not my parents, not my friends. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whisper in my head. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet, I swear I still hear my name being called softly from the dark. And every time, it sounds like it's coming from inside a locked door. I counted 31 kids when we left the field trip that day. But when the teacher read the names aloud, there were 32. We had just finished a long day trip to a natural history museum. The kind of trip where you're exhausted, your feet ache from walking, and the kids are buzzing from the sugar their parents packed in their lunchboxes. I was one of the chaperones, helping my daughter's 5th grade class. All I wanted was to get everyone back on the bus, get home, and collapse. The ride back started off normally. Kids laughed, swapped snacks, and played on their phones. The teacher, Mrs. Benton, sat at the front with a clipboard in her lap, running through her notes. She always did a head count before and after trips. I remember her standing up, clapping for quiet, and announcing she'd do the final roll call before we left the parking lot. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard her pause. She read through the familiar names, Ben, Emily, Jason, Mia, and then she stopped at one. Daniel. She said, frowning down at the sheet. Daniel, Lori? The bus went quiet. She looked up. No one answered. Daniel? She tried again, her voice sharper this time. Still, silence. She glanced back down at the sheet and muttered something under her breath. The kids looked around at each other, confused. None of them knew who she was talking about. I sure didn't. Mrs. Benton brushed it off with a nervous laugh, saying maybe she'd written it by mistake, and finished the list. But the way she held that clipboard tighter than usual told me it bothered her more than she admitted. We pulled out of the museum parking lot, but I couldn't shake the unease. I leaned over to her when the kids got loud again. Who's Daniel Lori? I asked quietly. She shook her head. I don't know. I only make these lists from the official roster. I don't add names. I should have let it go. But as the bus rolled down the darkening highway, the air inside felt heavy. The kids' laughter started sounding forced, like they were trying to drown out the weird tension. Every so often, I caught Mrs. Benton staring at that name. About half an hour later, a boy in the middle rows raised his hand. Mrs. Benton? He asked. His voice was shaky. There's a kid sitting in the back. She frowned, scanning the bus. Of course there is. Plenty of kids are back there. No, the boy whispered. I mean, I don't know him. A few heads turned, and then another girl spoke up. I saw him too. He wasn't with us at the museum. That's when the chatter died. The bus filled with the sound of the engine and the tires humming against the road. I turned around in my seat to look. The very back row was dim, half hidden in shadow from the bus's weak overhead lights. I thought I saw someone sitting there, hunched low, but every time I blinked, it looked emptier. Mrs. Benton stood. Everyone stay calm, she said, her voice trembling. She walked down the aisle slowly, clipboard in hand. Kids shrank into their seats, watching her. When she reached the back row, she stopped, her face drained of color. She stared at the seat for a long moment. Then, in a voice that shook, she said, "Daniel?" The air grew colder. I swear I felt it like a draft running through the bus, though all the windows were closed. She reached out her hand, as if to touch the figure slouched there. The bus lurched suddenly, hitting a bump, and the lights flickered. In that split second of darkness, I heard something, a low whisper, drawn out, almost like someone saying her name. When the lights came back, the seat was empty. Mrs. Benton stumbled back, clutching the clipboard to her chest. She didn't say a word as she hurried to the front and told the driver to keep going. The rest of the ride was silent. No one laughed, no one whispered. Even the kids who normally couldn't stay quiet sat stiff in their seats, eyes darting toward the back row like they expected someone to be sitting there again. When we finally pulled into the school parking lot, the kids filed off in record time. Parents were waiting, waving, hugging their children as though nothing had happened. But I noticed Mrs. Benton still gripping the clipboard, her knuckles white. I asked to see it one last time. The list looked ordinary 31 names I recognized. And then, at the very bottom, Daniel Laurie, written in the same neat handwriting as the rest. I glanced up at her. Maybe it was just a mistake, I offered weakly. Her eyes were wet, but she shook her head. No, I didn't write that name. She tore the sheet from the board, crumpled it in her fist, and whispered something I'll never forget. He answered when I called for him the first time. I swear I heard a boy say, "Here." She never brought up field trips again after that. And I don't blame her, because to this day, when I think back to that bus ride, I still see a faint outline of someone sitting in the back row. And the worst part? Whenever I count that memory in my head, I come up with 32. I caught my reflection smirking at me before I realized my face was still frozen in shock. It was the first time I understood how deeply wrong a mirror could feel. Our class trip to the local science center was supposed to be fun. It was one of those sleek, interactive museums filled with glowing buttons, echoing hallways, and glass cases that smelled faintly of cleaner and metal. I was 15, more interested in wandering around with my friends than actually learning anything. But I still remember the exhibit that drew me in, the Hall of Illusions. It was tucked in the back of the second floor, dimly lit with neon strips along the ceiling. The place was quiet compared to the louder, more popular exhibits downstairs. My teacher had given us an hour to roam, and most of my classmates stuck together in noisy groups while I peeled off on my own. The first thing I noticed were the mirror's floor-to-ceiling panels angled in strange ways, some warping your height, others stretching your arms, the usual funhouse tricks. But further in, I found one that looked completely normal. Just a plain, flat mirror in a simple black frame. It stood out because everything else in that room was designed to distort you. But this one showed me exactly as I was. Or at least, I thought it did. I stepped closer, squinting at my reflection. At first, nothing seemed strange. My dark hoodie, my messy hair, the backpack strap slung across my chest, it was all accurate. But as I leaned in, I noticed something subtle. My reflection was half a second too slow. If I lifted my hand, I saw it raise in the glass just after I had already done it. It wasn't like a glitchy video feed where it lagged behind. This was deliberate, like it was watching me before deciding to copy. I tested it again. I tilted my head left, then right. Each time, the mirror version followed, but fractionally late, like a person mimicking you instead of a reflection. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one else was around. The room was empty except for the low hum of the lights above me. When I looked back, I swear my stomach dropped, because my reflection was already staring directly into my eyes, before I had even lifted my head fully. And then it smiled. Not just a small twitch of the lips, but a slow, deliberate grin, stretching wider than I could ever force mine to go. I remember the way my chest tightened as I stood frozen, my real face pale and stiff, while the version of me in the glass bared its teeth like it had been waiting for me to notice. I stumbled backward, my sneakers squeaking against the tile. For a second, I thought maybe it was some kind of projection trick, an illusion meant to scare kids. But when I glanced at the edge of the mirror, there were no cameras, no hidden lights, just glass. I backed away and hurried out of the hall, forcing myself not to look back. For the rest of the day, I stuck with my friends, laughing too loudly at dumb jokes, trying to push the image out of my mind. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. It felt stupid to admit I was afraid of a mirror, but things only got stranger after we boarded the bus to head home. I sat by the window, earbuds in, watching the blur of buildings and streetlights pass. The glass was faintly reflective, and every so often I'd catch my own faint outline staring back at me. Except once, as I turned to look, I could have sworn the reflection was already facing me, waiting for me to notice, the exact same way it had in the exhibit. I yanked the curtain shut and refused to look again. That night, back at home, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my imagination. But as I was brushing my teeth, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I felt a horrible sense of déjà vu. My reflection stood there, mimicking me, but I couldn't stop staring at its eyes. They seemed a little too fixed, like it was focusing on something past me rather than with me. I tested it. I set my toothbrush down. My reflection set his down too, but with that same heartbeat of delay. My skin crawled. I couldn't take it. I turned off the bathroom light and bolted to my room, heart pounding. I left the mirror in the dark, door shut tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that when I saw it again, it would already be smiling. Over the next week, it kept happening in little ways. In the blank screen of my laptop, in the shiny metal of my locker door at school. Always that slight hesitation, like it was pretending, like it was thinking. The last time I saw it was the worst. I woke up in the middle of the night, parched, and went to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. The sliding glass door that led to our backyard was fogged slightly with condensation, but still reflective enough to catch my outline. Only it wasn't my outline. It was me, standing there in the dark on the other side of the glass, grinning like it had been waiting the entire time. I dropped the glass of water, and when it shattered against the floor, the reflection didn't even flinch. It just smiled wider. I don't look into mirrors anymore if I can help it. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll see, but because I'm terrified one day I'll glance away and realize the reflection hasn't stopped staring. And when that happens, I think it'll be the one stepping out. I still remember the way his eyes flicked to the mirror cold, unfamiliar, like he was checking if we had noticed yet. That was the moment I realized the man driving us wasn't our bus driver. We were on a school trip to a historic battlefield about 2 hours away from our town. I was in high school, a junior, and honestly the kind of kid who lived for field trips because it meant escaping the same old classroom walls. That day had gone normally enough. A long tour, lots of walking, lots of bored students, and teachers trying to keep everyone together. By the time we made it back to the parking lot, the sun was already low in the sky. Our yellow bus was right where we left it, and the group started piling in. I remember climbing the steps, glancing at the driver. He didn't say anything. Usually our driver, Mr. Lewis, would at least give us a nod or a "hey, guys." But this man just kept his head forward, one hand gripping the wheel. I didn't think too much of it in the moment. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe Mr. Lewis was having a bad day. We all took our seats. The teachers did a quick head count, and the bus rumbled to life. It felt normal at first, but not for long. About 15 minutes into the ride, something started nagging at me. The driver's posture wasn't the same too stiff. Both hands locked on the wheel instead of the casual one-handed grip Mr. Lewis always had. And his hair. Mr. Lewis had short gray hair, thinning on top. This driver's hair was darker, almost black, and longer at the back. I leaned forward in my seat, whispering to my friend across the aisle, "That's not him." "What?" "That's not our bus driver." She frowned, glanced up at the mirror, and quickly looked away. Her face went pale. "You're right. We weren't the only ones who noticed." A few rows back, a kid called out, "Where's Mr. Lewis?" The bus went uncomfortably silent after that. The man behind the wheel didn't answer. He just kept driving, eyes fixed on the road, jaw tight. One of the teachers finally stood up. Mrs. Callahan, my history teacher, walked toward the front. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but polite. "You're not our usual driver. Where's Mr. Lewis?" The man slowly turned his head just enough to glance at her. His lips curled into the faintest smile, and then, without a word, he faced forward again. Mrs. Callahan froze. I could see her hesitate, hand half raised like she wanted to say something more, but instead she backed away and sat down. Her face was drained of all color. That silence that followed was worse than any yelling or chaos could have been. Nobody dared speak. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional bump of the wheels over uneven pavement. I looked out the window. Something was wrong. We weren't heading toward the highway back to town. Instead, we were winding down narrow back roads lined with trees. No signs, no streetlights. Just darkness swallowing the horizon. Whispers started rippling through the bus. Kids were asking each other if they noticed, if the teachers were going to do something. The teachers, though, sat frozen in their seats. It was like none of them wanted to risk provoking him. The longer we drove, the stranger it felt inside that bus. It was cold, unnaturally cold. Like the AC was blasting, even though I could see, it wasn't. The windows fogged slightly at the edges, and every time I glanced up at the wide mirror above the driver, his eyes seemed locked on us, not the road. At one point, the bus slowed. He pulled onto a dirt path barely wide enough for the tires. Branches scraped against the sides with a screeching sound that made my stomach churn. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This isn't real. My friend clutched my arm and whispered, "Why are the teachers just sitting there?" I didn't know. I still don't. After what felt like forever, the bus came to a stop in the middle of the woods. No lights, no signs of life, just trees pressing in around us, shadows stretching across the foggy windows. The man stood up. For the first time since the trip began, he rose from his seat. He was taller than I expected, his shoulders broad enough to block out the glow from the dashboard. He turned, scanning the rows of students, eyes moving slowly from face to face. No one spoke. No one breathed. Finally, in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "Everyone out." Something in the way he said it wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was like a statement of fact, like he already knew we would obey. And for a terrifying second, it felt like we might. Then, behind us, headlights cut through the trees. Another bus appeared, rolling slowly up the dirt path. Relief surged through me so hard I nearly cried. The teachers jumped up, yelling for us to stay seated, stay put. The man in the driver's seat didn't flinch. He just stared at those approaching headlights in silence. Then, without another word, he stepped down off the bus and disappeared into the woods. The second bus pulled up beside us. Mr. Lewis was behind the wheel, waiting frantically, shouting for us to come over. We all rushed off our bus in a chaotic stampede. When I finally looked back, the other bus was gone. The dirt path behind us was empty. No tracks, no sign of anyone ever being there. To this day, I don't know who that man was or where he was trying to take us. But every time I see a school bus on a dark road, I check the driver's face, because I know what it feels like when the person behind the wheel isn't supposed to be there. I only heard it once, but it was enough. A voice that didn't belong to anyone in our group whispered my name in the dark, and to this day, I still don't understand how it knew me. I was in high school when it happened. Our earth science class took a trip to a local cave system that had been converted into a tourist attraction. It was one of those places with a guided tour, dim lights strung along the walls, and narrow paths that forced you to shuffle single file. I wasn't thrilled about going small spaces, always made me uncomfortable, but I figured it was better than another day stuck in class. The air inside was damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your clothes. Everything echoed. Footsteps, voices, even the occasional cough. Our guide, an older man with a booming voice, warned us before we started. The most important thing is to stick together. If the lights ever fail, it gets very dark in here. You won't see your own hand in front of your face. It sounded dramatic at the time, like something he said to scare kids into paying attention. But later, I would remember those words with a pit in my stomach. The tour started off fine. We shuffled past walls glistening with moisture, and the guide pointed out stalagmites and odd rock formations with names like the Frozen Waterfall and the cathedral ceiling. The deeper we went, the less it felt like a tourist attraction, and more like a place humans didn't belong. The air was heavy, and the ceiling dipped lower, forcing taller kids to duck. At one point, the guide stopped us in a large open chamber. He told us this was called the Whispering Cavern because of how sound carried. To demonstrate, he had us all go silent. Then he dropped a coin onto the rock floor. The tiny clink bounced and multiplied, sounding like dozens of coins hitting from every direction. We all laughed nervously, but I remember feeling a weird tightness in my chest, like we were being tested by the cave itself. That's when it happened. Without warning, the lights lining the cavern walls flickered and went out completely. We were plunged into a total darkness I had never experienced before. It wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. My brain expected to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The kind of nothing that made you dizzy if you stared too long. A few people gasped. Someone nervously laughed. The guide said, "Don't move, everyone. Stay where you are. The backup generator will kick in." We all waited, frozen. I held my breath and listened to the slow dripping of water echoing around us. I tried to remind myself it was just a cave, just rock and water, nothing else. But then I heard it, a whisper, faint, just behind me. It wasn't clear at first, more like a hiss of air. I assumed it was one of my classmates trying to freak me out, but then it grew sharper, cutting through the silence, and it said my name, not loud, not even threatening, just deliberate. A soft voice, inches from my ear, whispering, "David." Every muscle in my body tensed. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to spin around, to shove whoever it was, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd rooted to the floor. Then someone else screamed. A girl on the other side of the group shouted, "Stop! Who's there?" And I realized it wasn't just me. More whispers broke out in the cavern, overlapping. Low voices, like a dozen people murmuring secrets just out of reach. They didn't sound angry, just insistent. But the terrifying part was that each person seemed to hear something different. Some kids yelled at their friends to cut it out. Others swore they felt someone breathing on their neck. The whispers rose and fell, echoing in impossible ways, like the walls themselves were speaking. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the lights flickered back on. The cavern was still, silent. Everyone looked around wide-eyed, but we were all standing exactly where we had been. No one close enough to have whispered in anyone's ear. The guide's face was pale, though he tried to hide it. He said quickly, "Sometimes the acoustics play tricks on you. Let's keep moving." His voice was tight, rushed, like he wanted to get us out as soon as possible. None of us argued. The rest of the tour passed in a blur. Nobody laughed at the guide's jokes anymore. We stayed close together, some kids clinging to each other. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still clinging to me, like something had reached out during those few minutes and brushed against my mind. When we finally stepped back into daylight, I expected to feel relief, but instead, I felt watched. I still do sometimes when I'm alone in the dark. The part that unsettles me most? That whisper in my ear hadn't been just a random sound bouncing off the cave walls. It knew my name. She wasn't supposed to still be there. Hours after we'd left the battlefield, when the bus windows showed nothing but darkness and highway lights, I swear I saw her, our teacher, standing in the tall grass, waving as if she had never left at all. Our class trip to the battlefield wasn't anything I was particularly excited about. History never held my attention the way it did for some of my classmates. Still, the place itself had an eerie pull. The air felt heavier the moment we stepped off the buses, and even in daylight, the rolling fields and scattered trees seemed hushed, like they were still carrying the weight of everything that had happened there. The park ranger leading our tour spoke about soldiers who had died on the very ground beneath our feet. I remember the way he pointed at the grassy slopes and described them as temporary graves. A few of the kids made jokes to cut the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was quietly listening. Our teacher, Miss Harper, was unusually invested. She wasn't the type to get animated, but here she seemed almost entranced, asking more questions than the students, staring out across the fields with a kind of reverence. More than once I caught her lingering behind the group, snapping pictures on her phone of nothing in particular. Empty ridges, crooked fence posts, the bare trunks of trees. By late afternoon, the sky was dimming and the ranger wrapped up the tour. We were ushered back toward the parking lot where our buses idled, engines growling in the cool air. Everyone seemed eager to leave, chattering, shoving each other, joking about who fell asleep first on the ride back. That's when Miss Harper paused. "I'll catch up," she said lightly, holding her phone up. "Just one more photo." No one thought much of it. Teachers always took extra pictures on these trips for yearbooks or newsletters. We loaded onto the buses, found our seats, and waited. After a few minutes, Miss Harper returned, sliding onto the front seat with a smile like nothing was out of the ordinary. The drive back was long, nearly 3 hours to get home. The sun disappeared, and the battlefield turned into a memory behind us. Most of us dozed off, lulled by the hum of the bus. I sat near the back, headphones in, watching the darkness blur past the window. That's when I saw her. At first, it didn't register. Out beyond the glass, in the distance where the field met the tree line, a lone figure stood. The bus was moving fast, but the pale shape of a woman waving her arm was unmistakable. My stomach tightened. She looked exactly like Miss Harper. I sat up, pulling my headphones off, and pressed my face closer to the glass. For a split second, as the bus roared past, the figure turned toward us, her face catching the faint glow of the headlights. It was her. The same haircut, the same pale jacket she had been wearing. She was smiling, her arm raised high in a slow wave. Then she was gone, swallowed by the dark. I whipped my head around toward the front of the bus. Miss Harper was still there, sitting calmly in the first row, scrolling on her phone. She hadn't moved. A cold sweat prickled my arms. I wanted to tell someone, but the words stuck. How could I explain it without sounding insane? I sat back, heart pounding, replaying what I'd seen over and over. As we drove farther, I kept catching flashes in the periphery of the headlights. A woman standing by a split-rail fence. A figure in the middle of a slope. Always still, always waving. And always gone before I could get a good look. By the time we neared town, I was convinced I'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe the power of suggestion after a day full of grim history. I was almost ready to dismiss it when the bus stopped for a quick restroom break at a gas station. Everyone piled out, stretching, laughing. I lingered near the back, rubbing my eyes. That's when I noticed Miss Harper hadn't moved. She sat stiffly in her seat, staring straight down the aisle, phone clenched in her hand, but the screen dark. I hesitated, then took a step closer. "Miss Harper?" I asked. Her head turned slowly, too slowly, and for a split second, I thought her eyes didn't catch the light the way they should have. She gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her face. "You should get some rest," she said quietly. "Long ride still." Her voice was calm, but something in it unsettled me so deeply I almost stumbled back. I didn't say another word. I got off the bus, joined the others, and didn't look back until we were on the road again. The rest of the trip passed in silence. Nobody else seemed to notice anything wrong. But as we finally rolled back into our school's parking lot, I risked one last glance at her. Miss Harper was sitting perfectly still, phone clutched tight, eyes closed as if she'd been asleep for hours. Yet when I checked my own phone, scrolling through the handful of pictures I'd taken that day, my blood ran cold. In one of them, the very last photo on my roll, one I don't remember taking the battlefield, stretched out under the gray sky. And far off in the distance, standing alone in the tall grass, was Miss Harper. Her face was blurred, but her arm was raised in that same slow wave. I never told anyone, because part of me is still afraid that the woman who came back on the bus with us that night wasn't really Miss Harper at all. The first sound we heard wasn't the footsteps. It was the hiss of the bus door slamming shut on its own, even though no one had touched it. A few seconds later, we realized the lock had clicked from the outside. Our 8th grade class had just wrapped up a long field trip to a history museum in the city. Everyone was tired, lugging gift shop bags, and eager to sit down for the 2-hour ride back to school. The bus was parked in the far corner of the lot, away from the other groups, its lights dim in the late evening glow. At first, it felt like the usual routine. Climb aboard, drop into a seat, and zone out until we were home. I remember being one of the last students to get on. The bus driver wasn't there, which was a little strange. He'd been waiting at the wheel all morning when we left the school. But no one really thought much of it. Teachers were busy counting kids, chattering, and ushering everyone to sit down. The driver was probably using the restroom, we figured. I slid into a seat near the middle, next to my friend Jason. The bus smelled faintly of diesel and damp fabric, the kind of smell that clings to those old vinyl seats. The chatter around us was the usual end-of-trip noise. Kids complaining about being hungry, comparing what they bought, laughing too loud. Nothing unusual. Then, out of nowhere, the front door gave a loud metallic clank, like someone pulling the lever. It swung shut with a hiss, sealing the bus. At first, everyone thought it was just the driver, back without us noticing. But when we glanced at the front, the seat was still empty. That's when the teachers tried to open the door. Miss Howard tugged the handle a few times, her voice suddenly sharp. "It's locked," she said, half to herself. She yanked harder, but the door didn't budge. Another teacher came to help, their efforts only making the bus rock slightly on its tires. It was definitely locked from the outside. A ripple of unease went through the kids. Nervous laughter. A few jokes. But no one was laughing when we all heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps slowly making their way down the aisle. The problem was, no one was there. The aisle stretched straight down the bus, empty all the way to the back, but the sound was unmistakable. Heel to toe, as if someone invisible was walking between the seats. The noise traveled past where the teacher stood, past where Jason and I sat. Every few steps, the vinyl squeaked, as though someone was brushing against the seats. A couple of kids started screaming, swearing they saw movement in the reflection of the windows. I couldn't see anything, just the faint glow of the parking lot lights outside, bouncing off the glass. But the sound kept moving steady, slow, until it reached the very back of the bus. Then it stopped. The air felt suddenly heavy, like when a storm is about to break. Nobody dared speak. I remember my heart pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Then, as if mocking us, the footsteps started again, but this time heading back toward the front. Faster now. Miss Howard shouted for everyone to stay calm, but her voice was trembling. When the footsteps reached the middle of the bus, right near where Jason and I sat, something slammed into our seat from behind. The impact was so hard, the vinyl backrest shuddered and jolted us forward. Jason jumped up, spun around nothing. No one was there. That was when kids started pounding on the windows, yelling for help. But outside, the lot had emptied. The museum was closed, lights shutting off one by one, leaving the parking lot darker and darker. If anyone could hear us, they weren't coming. Then the footsteps changed. They weren't moving anymore. They were pacing, back and forth, just a few rows behind us, as if someone was deciding what to do next. Each pass felt closer, though the aisle still looked empty. I pressed myself against the window, gripping the armrest so tight my fingers hurt. Suddenly, the pacing stopped. And then came the breathing. It was faint at first, but once you heard it, there was no mistaking it. Slow, labored breaths, rising and falling, right there in the aisle. Some kids swore they felt the air shift, like someone leaning close to their necks. One girl screamed, and that seemed to trigger chaos. The teachers ordered everyone to the front, crowding us near the locked door, as far away from the aisle as possible. We huddled there, clutching each other, as the breathing grew louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, the bus door let out that same metallic clank. The lock popped, and the doors swung open on their own. No one moved at first. It was like the bus was daring us to step outside. Finally, Miss Howard shouted for everyone to go, and we bolted. Dozens of feet hit the pavement at once, kids spilling into the night air, running for the teachers' cars and the faint glow of the main road. I glanced back once, just once. The bus sat there, doors yawning open, lights flickering faintly inside. And for the briefest second, I swear, I saw the outline of someone standing in the driver's seat, someone tall, their head bent low to fit, watching us scatter into the dark. We never saw that driver again, and no one ever explained how the bus locked itself that night. I woke up to the sound of paper sliding against the carpet, like someone had pushed a note under my hotel door. When I checked, there wasn't just a piece of paper waiting for me. There was also a room key. This happened my sophomore year of high school, during an overnight field trip to Washington, D.C. We were staying at a mid-tier chain hotel, a kind with long, identical hallways that all smelled faintly of chlorine from the pool downstairs. The teachers had crammed us into rooms of 4, and after a long day of museums and walking tours, my roommates and I had all collapsed into bed by around midnight. Sometime after 1, I stirred awake to that soft sound, the faint scrape of paper against carpet. The room was dimly lit by the blinking light from the smoke detector, but I could clearly see something had been slipped under our door. Curious, I climbed out of bed quietly. trying not to wake my friends, and picked it up. It wasn't just a note. Along with the folded piece of hotel stationery was one of those plastic room keys, identical to the ones we'd been given at check-in. My stomach sank a little as I opened the note. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, but readable. It said, "Come alone, the others can't know." That was it. No name, no explanation. Just those words. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of the guys from the other rooms was trying to mess with me. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. Teachers had been patrolling the halls. They specifically warned us against leaving notes or wandering between rooms. Anyone caught would be sent home. None of my friends would risk that just to freak me out. I tried to shake it off, but my curiosity gnawed at me. Whose room did this key belong to? Why me? I slipped the note and key into the pocket of my hoodie and lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the hotel pipes made me tense. After about 20 minutes, I gave in. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, put on my sneakers, and carefully unlocked the door, praying it wouldn't wake my roommates. The hallway was empty. Dim yellow light spilled from the wall sconces, making everything look washed out and eerie. I glanced up and down both ends. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. I walked to the nearest elevator alcove and tried the key on one of the doors there. The green light blinked and the lock clicked open. My chest tightened. The room beyond was dark, curtains drawn, air heavy. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulbs were either burned out or deliberately unscrewed. The only illumination came from the faint city glow slipping through a crack in the curtain. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and whispered, "Hello?" Silence. The room looked normal enough at first glance. 2 beds, a desk, a TV, but the beds were made too neatly, the surfaces too bare. It didn't look like anyone had checked in. No suitcases, no toiletries, nothing personal. Then I noticed something that made my throat go dry. On the desk, by the TV, was a small stack of papers. My hands trembled as I picked them up. They were printed copies of class rosters, our names, grouped by hotel room number. Each page had notes scribbled in the margins, times, arrows, underlined names. And on my page, my name was circled several times in thick black ink. I dropped the papers like they were on fire. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but just as I turned for the door, I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of the handle turning. Panic surged through me. I glanced around the room for another exit, nothing but a second-floor window sealed shut. The door clicked once, then again, harder this time. Someone was trying to come in. I darted into the narrow gap between the bed and the wall, pressing myself flat against the carpet. My breath felt deafeningly loud in my own ears as the door finally opened. The room filled with darkness as a tall figure stepped inside. They didn't turn on the lights. They didn't say anything. I couldn't see their face, only the outline of someone broad-shouldered, moving with a calm, purposeful slowness. They crossed the room toward the desk, and I heard the papers rustle. My stomach twisted. I'd left them scattered. The figure lingered there for what felt like forever, then turned and began walking toward the beds. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to bolt. I felt the mattress above me dip, just slightly, as if they were leaning over it. Then the sound of slow, steady breathing filled the silence. I don't know how long I stayed frozen. Eventually, after what must have been minutes, the figure moved again. The door opened, then shut softly behind them. I didn't wait. I scrambled out from behind the bed, ran out of the room, and sprinted down the hall back to mine. My hands shook so badly, I could barely get the key card in the slot. When I finally slipped back inside, my roommates were still asleep, unaware. The next morning, I tried to find the room again. I counted the doors carefully, retracing my steps. But the key didn't work anymore. The door I thought I had opened the night before was locked, unmarked, and according to the hotel staff, hadn't been rented out in weeks. I never told the teachers. I barely even told my friends. But I still have that note, tucked away in a box at home. Every now and then, I take it out and stare at those words. Come alone. The others can't know. And I wonder who slipped it under my door. And what would have happened if I hadn't gone alone?